didn't have to grab a mic or anything. And I have a fancy clicker. This is like really special. So I'm Jessica Parsons, and this is Post-Monolithic Content Management. I did not bother with trying to make audio work to play the 2001 music. You can just imagine it in your head. So a little bit about me. I work for Netlify as well. I am a developer support engineer, and so I write documentation, I help people out in using our tools and all the things that we do, and a whole bunch of other stuff because we're a little company. And I also am a teacher for Girl Develop It, which is a nonprofit that teaches coding workshops to adult women, despite the name. And it's something that I really enjoy doing. And we have a chapter here in San Francisco, and one in San Jose, and one starting up in Oakland. So very exciting. I also volunteer for my local Code for America brigade, which is OpenSMC. And Code for America is, well, you've probably heard of that, but they have a brigade program, which is volunteer groups that are throughout the country. We have one in San Francisco, there's one in Oakland, there's one in San Jose, and there's one in San Mateo County. And I encourage you to visit those. They're all on Meetup, and do some coding for your community. Both of those tie into something else that I've been working with, which you've heard about earlier tonight, which is Code for Good Week. Some of us from Girl Develop It and SFHTML5 and Code for America brigades are putting together an event for people to help open source projects that do things for social good or for civic engagement or things like that. And we're kicking it off at SFHTML5's July meetup at the very end of July. And then the following week will be Code for Good Week, and we're going to have a bunch of events. And we're also asking for people to submit projects. So if you know of a project that is something that is helping other people, working for diversity in tech, creating civic engagement, keeping your drains in your community from getting clogged, any sorts of things that you might be involved with, I encourage you to apply. I'll put a link in the comments for the meetup. And our deadline is actually the 15th, which is Monday. So if you have an idea, tell us about it now. So all of those things actually relate to some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this talk. So talking about how I got here. Started out with my first website that I ever made, which was in 2006. And it was for my employer's side business. And it was just a static HTML and CSS site, pretty simple. It only had like 5 pages in it, so it wasn't very difficult to manage. But it's still kind of a pain because it didn't have templating in it, you know. So if I changed one of the menu items, I'd have to copy and paste it to every single file, and that was a huge pain in the butt. But you know, there were other things that were cool about that like everything about that site and so many sites then were in the source in the browser, and you could learn so much that way. And so there were kind of trade-offs there. I made a few of those sites, and then I come from a background in teaching, and so one of the next ones that I made was a site for a school where I worked. And the thing about sites for schools is that they have lots and lots of content. Dozens, maybe hundreds of pages, frequently updated, you know, homework assignments, weekly newsletters, all these sorts of things are always on there. And many editors, you know, every teacher might want to post their homework assignments, and that doesn't really work very well with a static site that has no templating. Now, I could have gone at least the templating step for that, but still, what I really needed was something that people who don't write code could edit the content on that. What I needed was a content management system. And this is actually about the time that I learned what those even existed. So what that meant at the time was the monolithic CMS. So what I just have showing right now is the basic templating thing. So even without a CMS, even back then, this is a step that people like kind of skip a lot of times, is you could have a templated site that, you know, used very often PHP, but other languages as well. to create templates for your pages, have all the content in the database, pull it in, and build those pages when people ask for them. And then what the CMS did was it added all this other stuff. It added a UI for connecting to the database, for creating new posts and editing them and removing them and updating them. Not quite in that order. It had the templating that you could get elsewhere, but with that nice UI on top of it, it still did the on-request page builds. And it also often tied in a lot of other functions, because all of that content was all stored in this one big database, like everything. The posts, the users, the settings, the version control, all of that was stored in the database. And so if you were going to access all of that stuff, you were using basically all of the same software. So if you were searching or if you're dealing with authentication, all of it was built into this one piece of software. And you'll see why that's important later. But it's kind of a pattern that we've been talking about. But as we talked about before, when the visitor arrives, the page builds from the database. And when the CMS is added, when a writer edits a post, the CMS writes to the database. So all of those things are all happening within the same box, right? Now, there are different types of CMSs, monolithic CMSs. The first one I used was a hosted CMS as a service. The one I used was called Light CMS. WordPress.com works kind of like this, and there are other hosted CMSs as a service. They vary, but there are certain things that they have in common, generally speaking. Generally speaking, the company handles the hosting. So it's hosted up as a service. It's up there. They handle the updates. They do all that stuff. The developer will have limited templating control, perhaps only front-end code, sometimes a little bit of other back-end code, but generally speaking, you're pretty restricted. There generally aren't third-party plugins and extensions, but you do have that editor UI so that content editors can make all their fancy changes without having to bug you about it. That's really nice. So, wow, it's really washed out on those screens. It looks better on mine. So there are trade-offs with that. Looking at that, as far as control goes, that one's on the low end. You don't have as much control when you're working with a hosted service. But also, when you have less control, you also have less upkeep. You don't have to deal with the updates. You don't have to worry about the security. You have to trust that they are worrying about the security, but that's not your problem. You don't have to worry about the upkeep. And the ease of use is still there. You've got that UI, and so that's really nice. Those are good. The cost varies. They really vary a lot, actually, from like $20 a month to like $2,000 a month or more, or $20,000 a month. They really can vary a lot. They tend to be on the higher side, so that one's kind of a negative. That's why it's yellow and has a sort of frowny face for colorblind people. And that worked pretty well for me, but the control aspect was frustrating because there were things that I wanted to do that, oh, I only have this kind of a form widget, and I want to have this kind of a form widget. So I moved on to more self-hosted CMSs. They're a little more self-service. They're a little more flexible. So an example of that would be WordPress.org. So that's their open source version that you can install on your own server or on a hosted server or somewhere else. You worry about the hosting. You worry about the updates. That means that you have significant templating and function control. You have all the control over what's happening on the server-side code. You can access the database whatever way that you want. You can do your own queries. You can make your own custom post types. Lots and lots of control. You can also use third-party extensions and plugins and things like that. And you still get that UI. Now that I've got all that control, now I have to do a whole bunch of upkeep. So it was like, oh, I've got all this control. That's great. But you can't just hand it off to somebody and say, hey, here's the site. Just take care of it and click update and hope it doesn't break. So then that's kind of a frustrating trade-off. And so I was like, this is pretty good. This gets me pretty far. I have the control. All I have to do is deal with the updates all the time. But it works for me. And then a couple of years ago, I discovered static site generators. And the cool thing about static site generators is they took a piece of that puzzle. They didn't take the whole thing, but they took a piece of it. So this is that monolithic CMS. And a static site generator does about that much. So it does part of it. It takes care of the templating, so I didn't have to do that copying and pasting anymore. And it'll build the pages from that. It'll build RSS templates usually. It replaces the database with files, and that's where your posts are. Your posts are all just files. Your users might be in a JSON file. Your settings might be in a YAML file, but it's all just files. There is no database. And you take those files, and when the developer edits, because you're doing this in code, it pre-builds the site as files. And when the visitor goes to the site, it requests that finished file, right? So that took care of some things because there are some advantages to that. Here's my evaluation with that one. Some examples I put up there. Jekyll, Hugo, Gitbook are some examples of them. You've heard about some others tonight. The more link in there, if you go to the slides, shows you staticgen.com, which has a whole gigantic listing of all the static site generators. There's a lot of them. And some of the benefits of it are free, high-quality hosting. That was the first thing that got me excited about this, which was that if you're hosting a WordPress site or really any server-side site with a database, you're going to have to start paying something for your hosting. It's going to be in one place. If you're going to try and get free hosting that can do server-side, like WordPress with a database, it's kind of scary hosting, and you probably don't want to use it. But I discovered, hey, I got GitHub Pages. I can do that for free. Then I just started discovering these other static site hosts, and including Netlify. And I thought, oh, okay, so this is really cool. I can put these static sites on these free hosts. I can use this generator, can take care of the templating. There's no software updates required. That is nice. Okay, I had my WordPress sites. I had to keep updating. But if you got your HTML files, you can just like pass that off. And if they never touch it and never update it again, who cares? They're just files. And that is really nice. On the downside, the content has to be written in code. And yes, Markdown and HTML do count as code. Yes, I know it's not a Turing-complete programming language, but it's not English either, so it's code. And so the developer does have templating, but limited functionality because you don't have server-side code. And so you get a reduction in control. You totally lose that ease of use that you had from the UI, but much better upkeep and much better cost. So again, I'm still not seeing green across the board, but it's getting interesting. And now, with the developer templating, it has limited functionality, but there are things you can do to make up for that. Some of that we've been talking about tonight. APIs really fill in a lot of that. So just tossing up some examples about that. For comments, for example, you can use Discuss. For if you want to have some back-end connections, you can use GraphQL or Horizon or Firebase or a whole bunch of other ones. E-commerce, you can use Snipcart. Forms, you can use Wufoo or FormSpree or other ones. Netlify has built-in form reading. So there are a lot of different services you can use for these things. And if you go to the slides online, all of those are actually links too. So there's a couple reasons why I really loved static site generators. One of them is just that my own creativity thrives on restriction. Like when I've got limits and it's like, oh, you can only work within this box, I suddenly get tons of ideas of what I can do inside that box. Whereas if you said like, make anything you want, I'd be like, I have no idea. So that totally got me excited. The other thing was that it was perfect for other things that I was really getting into at that time, which was teaching new developers and doing civic tech volunteering. And in both of those cases, it was really, really nice to have something that I could make, or someone else could make, a low-cost, simple site that could be handed off to someone else. So a new developer could talk to the pizzeria down the street and say, hey, you really need a website. I could make one for you. It could be part of my portfolio. You wouldn't have to pay a cent, and you could totally have your business hours on there all the time, you know? And then they could pass it off, put it up on the web, never think about it again if they don't want to, and it's free, and it just works. That's really cool. And also for civic tech volunteering, I could make projects. I can do a data visualization of, you know, what's going on in the city's budget. And I can put that up there, and I can host it free, and I can pass it off to someone else to deal with, and I don't have to worry about it getting updated or the cost of hosting or any of those things. Those were both really, really, really cool. What I didn't like about it was it still didn't have that ease of use. That was frustrating because you can't pass that off to the pizzeria and say, okay, well, next time that you want to change your menu, you're going to have to call me to edit the HTML or the markdown to make that work. And that's kind of a downside. So really what I was really, really hoping for was like, this is super cool, except we need a CMS. That was what was the missing piece out of that puzzle. At least that's how I phrased it. And it turns out I wasn't alone in this. One of the earlier attempts at a CMS was made by Development Seed, and they had some similar interest to me. They're an agency that they do a lot of work in government projects and nonprofits and things having to do with civic tech. They did the working landing page for healthcare.gov, for example, which is a Jekyll site. And they built a tool called Prose.io. And Prose is like kind of a first attempt at a CMS that kind of does the job. So it's basically a wrapper for GitHub. You tie it into your GitHub account, and then you can see your files in GitHub, and you can make edits to them. And the Markdown editor you can see a preview of, sort of. And then you can make commits, and it's got like a form for your front matter. I would demo, but I'm not on my own computer. So my computer didn't work. And it's open source, and it's pretty cool. And when I first saw Prose, I thought, this could be the solution for me with the civic tech projects that I'm doing. We made a Jekyll site. I can have people who are not coders update the site using Prose. It didn't work. It was too hard. The first hump was they had to have GitHub accounts. That was not too hard to solve. But once they had that, then they're like, but wait, how do these files work? And it didn't quite bridge that gap. It didn't do what I hoped it would do. But it was going in the right direction. It turns out there's a whole bunch of other solutions out there now. Headlesscms.org has a listing of a whole variety of CMSs for static site generators. They work in all sorts of different ways. So there are some more that are Git-based. Some of them are API-driven, so they have an API that serves up your content as JSON and sends it over to your site generator or in other ways. Some tie into services like Google Docs. So there's one that you just put your content into like a Google spreadsheet and it works from there, which is kind of weird. Some of them are open source and some of them are proprietary. One of them, which isn't on there because it doesn't quite count as a headless CMS, but it sort of fits in other ways. It's called Shifter. It actually takes your WordPress site, so it has the whole WordPress UI, and builds it as a static site. So it's like a static site generator from WordPress. So if you really want to take baby steps, that's one way to do it. So there's a lot of people approaching it from a lot of different ways. When I looked around, well, I hadn't found this site yet, but I had kind of not found something that really fit. So I went to the Jamstack SF meetup, which I was interested in because I'm totally into all these static site generators. I love this whole static site thing. I'm going to these meetups. And I said, this is really cool, but, we really need a CMS. That's what's missing in the static sites space, like a good CMS that does what we need it to. And they said, hey, we're making one. That was Matt saying that. And that's what they were working on at Netlify. I said, okay, that sounds good. So I learned about Netlify CMS, which in some ways is kind of like Prose. It is open source like Prose. It is Git-based like Prose. It is a wrapper for Git functions. But it kind of takes it a step further. It's got some fancy features. So it has an editorial workflow built in. And this is kind of a little sample of the way that works, so that when you write a post, you can save it as a draft, and then you can keep editing that if you want. And what it's doing on the back end in Git is when you save a draft in there, it creates a branch, and it pushes a commit to that branch, and it makes a PR for it. And then you can drag it over to waiting for review. It adds some metadata to it. And that's just that more is an indicator for the other people who are editing with you. You say, hey, this one's ready. If it's in a draft, don't look at it. When it's into waiting for review, that's like you took off the WIP tag. And then when it's waiting to go live, you can move it over into here. And then when you click push now, it merges the PR. So it's basically taking your regular Git functions and putting them into a UI. And that's kind of handy. But it's not making you think about Git. You're thinking about, okay, this is how my content flow works, but on the back end, it's doing all the same Git stuff, and you can look in GitHub and you can see, and it does have to be GitHub at this point. It relies on the GitHub API. And you can look in there and see the PR. You can see the branches. You can see the commits. It still works just like regular Git, but has this nice, pretty UI for it. Oops, I didn't need that. I can use my remote. It's also got a handy markdown preview, like that happens live and that you can put styling into it, which is pretty cool. So you can actually make this, and I say it in the next thing, it's made with React. So you can actually build those things as components and put those components into the UI. And so you can say, hey, I'm going to have a custom widget, and it's going to look like this, and my title widget, it's going to look like this. These are the styles that I'm going to pull in. You can have custom blocks of content. So that actually does a little bit more than your typical Markdown one, because it can actually put HTML into the middle of your stuff instead of typing up Markdown and then doing those weird Markdown plugins to say, oh, I want a block of content that looks like a block quote or that has like special style to it. You can just make those in your components with your custom widgets, and it'll HTML it in there. So that's another handy feature. It can also, which you can't do with pros, be configured not to need GitHub users. I didn't capitalize that properly. So you can actually, if you set up your own authentication, the easiest way is to use it with GitHub authentication and Netlify tied into it. But it is possible to do it with your own authentication. If you listened really closely to Matt's talking, and you learned all about how to do all that JSON web tokens and all those things, and you're like, oh, I'm totally pro at that, you can do it that way. Eventually, it will be easier to do it that way, but right now, it takes a little bit of work. So I thought, this is pretty cool. I'm kind of liking this thing. This is really starting to meet the needs of what I was looking for. I have my love for my static site generators, and now I got a CMS that I think is going to do this. And well, a couple of months later, I started working for Netlify. And that was pretty cool. I start diving in, and 3 weeks after I start, the first really big user of the CMS, which was Smashing Magazine, you heard about that a couple times already, decided to announce that they're using Netlify. And they're using the Netlify CMS, and they are replacing their WordPress site with this thing that a whole bunch of people have never heard of called Netlify CMS. And they made an article about it. It's not on, it's in beta still. And they put up this thing, hey, here's our beta version. And all of a sudden, we got a ton of traffic. All of a sudden, I had like hundreds of thousands of people looking, I don't know, it was more, I think it was millions, looking at my docs, which was like super embarrassing. I'm like, I hope they're not like misspelled or something. And all these people started looking at it, and all these people started reading articles, and it's on the top of Hacker News like 3 times in a day, and tons of people coming in. And that was pretty overwhelming. I will say one thing that did not happen is our servers didn't crash or anything like that, because, we got the CDN, we got the static sites, all those things that we've been talking about, they worked. So that was cool. But what did happen is we got a lot of unexpected questions. We got these strange questions in support that I was like, wait, what are these people talking about? So, for example, we got one that said, whoop, oh, darn it, spoiler. And somebody said, well, okay, so in the CMS, can I show 2 different types of posts in the same page? So like, for example, say I've got like a pet adoption website, and I've got like cat type posts, and I've got dog type posts. Can I put those like all in the same list on the same page? And like, well, the first thing I thought was this from Ghostbusters. I just, in my head, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria, but that wasn't what they were talking about either. But I was still like, well, the CMS, it's just a Git wrapper. Like that's your static site generator. What do you mean? Yeah, sure, you can show multiple posts on the same page. Yeah, that doesn't have to do with the CMS, but sure, yeah. And then they started asking. I had one say, does it support multilingual sites? Well, again, that's kind of a static site generator thing. Like the CMS is just a wrapper for your content. You can put whatever content in there you want. Why are they asking? This is kind of confusing. And then they asked, like, well, how does it handle site search? And some people actually started answering that question. Oh, when you want to search posts in the CMS and you want to like find, the post that you've written that you want to edit, yeah, you can do it this way. And he's like, no. Like when a user comes to the site and they want to search for something in the site, does the CMS do that? It was like, wait, what do you mean? No, the CMS is just a wrapper for Git. It's not. That's something you tie into your. Oh, really? Like, why would you? Okay. And it kind of took me back, and I got kind of confused. And then this person who asked about the site thing said, this isn't a content management system at all. It's an editing tool. And I was like, well, that's what I thought a content management system was. It's an editing tool. That's why I said we needed a CMS. We need an editing tool. What do you mean? And then I started thinking about it. And, well, for this guy, like, this is a CMS. It's the monolithic CMS. It's one big box with everything in there, everything in the same place. It's that database, and it connects to all those things. So when you want to search, it's part of the CMS. And when you want to put your pages together and you put like dogs and cats living together, it's part of the CMS. And all those different things, they all fit into that one big box. So that's why they're asking this question, because like these people they didn't follow the path that I had followed. They didn't go like, oh, static site generators, these are cool. Oh, but I just need an editing tool. I call that a CMS. So that's what this is. That's what that means. No, these people were coming from like other CMSs, and they said, oh, Netlify CMS. This is some sort of like, well, where's the database? Where's this stuff? Like, how do I get to this stuff? Like, they're coming from like a totally different direction. And I was like, okay, this is a different way of thinking about things. And so now what we're looking at is a different kind of CMS. This is our post-monolithic CMS. And now we can have this all in a whole bunch of different boxes. I mean, they might be on the same box, but it's not all in one giant box. It's separated out now. So you have your site generator, and that took these two and put them all into one thing. That handles the templating, puts your pages, might handle your comments, puts your RSS, all those things that we talked about, on edit, builds the page, all those sorts of things. And then your database gets replaced, again, with files, and very often, it's actually handled by Git, right, for your version control part of it. And you got all your files, the code, the posts, the authors, the comments. So that's probably stored somewhere else. Your database is on GitHub or wherever you've got your code hosted. Your site generator is the part that puts it all together. And then when you get to the CMS, that's its own box. It's not handling these things. It's over here. It is your UI. Instead of being a UI for the CRUD functions in the database, this is your UI for Git. And it might be doing on-request page serving of the CMS itself. If it's, for example, a single-page React app, it is actually, serving up those little pages, and it's putting it together and then making your CMS. But that's its own separate box from the other part. And then when people were talking about your authentication and your search, which might be part of that whole big CMS, now they might be handled by separate APIs. So you've got an authentication API, and your search might be either you use like a JavaScript library for it, or you use an API like Algolia or something like that handles your search. So now these are all in all these different little boxes. So when someone says, can the CMS do this? Well, it's like, well, that's not the CMS's job anymore. It's actually like all these things are in their own separate parts. And so that kind of got me to thinking. And I just loved the opportunity to stick the Velociraptor in there, because it's a Velociraptor. And it really started making me thinking, because this person had come in here, and he was actually really upset. And he's like, why are you calling this a CMS? Like, that may work for you with the investors in Silicon Valley, but like people in the real world, it doesn't make any sense. Like, that's not a CMS. And so I was like, okay, so let's take a couple steps back here. And we started talking about it and started explaining, like, okay, so you got this part and this part. And we went through and we talked about it. And by the end of it, he actually understood. And then he was like, oh, okay, I get it. I kind of feel like I'm leveling up now, which was, I gotta say, as a support person, it was pretty satisfying. But but it was kind of fun too, because like this is actually like a new way of thinking about things. And this isn't just about CMSs. It's actually a change in the way that we think about development. And this applies to the whole philosophy of the Jamstack or of building websites in this way, in a decoupled fashion, and without those monoliths. And there are advantages to that. Like you've kind of been seeing, things about low upkeep, as I like to say, high neglectability. You can totally not think about it, and it's cool. Like we were saying earlier, low cost with high scalability. Modularity, so you can have things, instead of having to get this CMS that is built to have search and authentication and comments and all these things that you might not need, you can take just the parts that you need. On the flip side of that, we'll get to that, but you can also leverage specialization so that instead of having to have one thing that does the search and does the your e-commerce and all those things, or you have to make it, or you have to find a service that can do all those things. That's the jack of all trades that has to be like an expert of all trades. Instead, you can get the expert for each one. You can get someone who really does e-commerce really well, and you use their API. You get someone who does comments really well, and you use their API. And you can take advantage of that specialization. So those are all really cool. On the flip side, it also adds some challenges, like API fatigue, anyone? I mean, that is the thing. Like, now that we have all these choices, we have all these choices. And there's a lot of them. And how do you figure out, like, which one's the best one to use? And how do I get them to all hook in together? And that's kind of takes some doing. That's a challenge. And then the other thing is kind of what we came to when I was talking to these people who are asking questions that I wasn't even expecting. And that's this paradigm shift in how we think about the way that we're developing. And we're not thinking about it as one big box. We're thinking about it as pieces, and how do we make those pieces work? And what does that mean when now I've got all my front-end code here? Where do I hide the things that need to be hidden, that they can't be in the browser? And how do I handle managing content that's in a static site generator? Or how do I handle search? How do I handle things that happen in real time? It takes a new way of thinking about things. And for me, as a teacher and a developer and someone who does these things, it's really, really exciting because it's fun to learn about the way that people are thinking about them and take these new perspectives and put them together and think about how we're going to be making this new part of the web and this new way of making things and how we can think about those things. And I find that exciting. So that's all. Thank you very much. You can find the slides there at slides.com/verythorough. I'm very thorough on Twitter and pretty much everything else. It's hard to repeat the joke, but it's true. I'm pretty thorough about it. And yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you.